The humiliated maid fled the ball in tears, but the most desired duke took her hand and whispered, "You're safe now." The mantelpiece clock bore witness to its own arrest. 1 minute past 7, eternally frozen. Clara Merrow had passed it 1,000 times during her service at Harrowcombe House, and each passage reinforced the singular truth of her existence. Time did not move for those beneath notice. This evening, however, time moved with deliberate cruelty. The household had been in ferment since dawn. The Earl of Blackwell's autumn ball, a spectacle that drew the county's most coveted names, would transform the grand rooms into a constellation of silk and jewels. Clara had mended 6 gowns, starched petticoats until her fingers bled faintly into the linen, and arranged flowers in arrangements so precise that Mrs. Rensley, the housekeeper, had merely nodded her approval without a single commendation. "You are to attend the servants' gallery, Mrs." Rensley had pronounced that afternoon, her voice sharp as flint. "Should Lady Blackwell require anything, refreshment, adjustments to her toilette, you will descend and perform your duty with invisible grace. You understand invisibility, Miss Merrow, do you not? It is your greatest asset." Invisibility. The word had settled in Clara's chest like a stone. By 9 o'clock, the ballroom blazed with candlelight. Clara stood at the gallery's edge, watching the spectacle unfold beneath her. The orchestra played a waltz of such sweetness that it seemed to mock the very air with beauty. Women in gowns of pearl and amethyst glided past men in dress uniforms and evening coats. Jewels caught the light and threw it back like captured stars. And then came the moment that would unravel everything. Lady Blackwell's pearl earring had fallen. Clara noticed it before anyone else, a glimmer beneath the edge of the refreshment table, half buried in the hem of the ballroom curtain. Without thought, driven only by the muscle memory of service, she descended the narrow servants' stair, crossed the ballroom's periphery, and knelt to retrieve it. She had not meant to be seen, but the ballroom's gaze, trained by years of hierarchy, found her instantly. "Good heavens," came a voice of polished ice, "is that a maid amongst the dancers?" Lady Honoria Blackwell stood not 3 feet distant, her plum silk gown catching the light like bruised velvet. Her expression bore the precise architecture of aristocratic disdain, eyebrows elevated, mouth curved in a smile that resembled a blade's edge. "My dear," Lady Honoria continued, addressing the small circle that had begun to gather, "one almost mistakes the household staff for guests these days. Tell me, girl, did you escape your post, or are you simply unaware that your kind do not traverse the dance floor?" The words fell like stones into still water. The musicians faltered. A few titters, tentative at first, then gathering confidence, rippled through the assembled crowd. Clara's hands trembled. She clutched the earring, its pearl still warm from her palm. "I was merely—" Lady Blackwell required, "Did I ask for your explanation?" Lady Honoria's voice remained perfectly composed, which somehow amplified its cruelty. "Your presumption is noted. You may return to the servants' quarters. Such obvious displays of social confusion are quite fatiguing to witness." The laughter swelled. It came from the mouths of women whose gowns Clara had pressed, from men whose coats she had brushed. The hall seemed to contract, pressing inward, suffocating her with the weight of 100 eyes that saw her not as human, but as a breach of decorum, a rupture in the fabric of proper order. Clara turned, her vision blurred. She walked, not ran, toward the garden entrance, for to run would be to confirm every whisper, every suggestion of her unworthiness. But once beyond the ballroom's threshold, once the autumn night had wrapped around her like a shroud, she fled. The gardens were wet with recent rain. Her slippers, serviceable and plain, soaked through within moments. Her breath came in gasps that matched the rhythm of her footsteps. Behind her, the ballroom continued its revelry, indifferent to the small wound it had inflicted. She found refuge beneath the stone arbor at the garden's far edge, where climbing ivy had begun to surrender to autumn's touch. There she wept, not silently, but with the profound, shaking sobs of one who had been rendered utterly invisible and, in that invisibility, utterly broken. She did not hear the footsteps at first. When she finally raised her head, it was to find a figure emerging from the darkness, tall, composed, moving with the deliberate grace of one accustomed to command. The moonlight caught his features, angular jaw, steel-grey eyes that held something she could not name. Duke Alistair Harrowcombe stood before her, still dressed in his evening coat, his expression grave, with something that resembled genuine concern. "You," he said quietly, "are not required to endure this alone." and as he extended his hand into the rain-damp darkness, Clara Merrow felt something shift. Not hope, perhaps, but the first tremor of a possibility she had believed forever sealed away. The Duke's hand remained suspended in the damp autumn air, neither demanding nor commanding, merely present as though offering Clara a choice she had not known herself to possess. The rain intensified, falling in sheets that rendered the garden a place untethered from the ordinary world. "Your Grace," Clara whispered, her voice hoarse from weeping, "you ought not be here, you ought not be seen speaking to me." The Duke's lips curved with something that resembled irony. "I assure you, Miss Merrow, Clara Merrow, I am merely a housemaid at—" "I am aware of who you are, Miss Merrow," he said, and something in his tone suggested that he had, in fact, observed her with more attention than her station should have warranted. "It is Lady Honoria's conduct that requires correction, not your existence." He drew closer, his overcoat falling open to reveal the austere elegance of his formal dress. Up close, his eyes held the grey of winter mornings, cool, yet not without warmth. "Your tears do you credit. They demonstrate a capacity for feeling that your tormentors have apparently surrendered entirely." Clara accepted his hand. The contact was neither prolonged nor improper, yet it conveyed something that transcended propriety, a recognition, perhaps, an acknowledgement that she possessed substance beyond the boundaries of her uniform. "The ballroom has returned to its revelries," the Duke continued, offering her his arm as they moved beneath the arbor's stone shelter. "Lady Honoria is doubtless regaling others with her triumph, and yet I find myself more interested in understanding why a woman of evident grace and intelligence permits herself to be diminished by the pronouncements of those who mistake cruelty for wit." "Because, Your Grace, I possess no alternative," Clara replied, surprised by her own frankness. "She is society's arbiter. I am but a servant. The hierarchy is fixed. To resist would be to confirm every judgment leveled against me." The Duke was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed upon the rain-soaked gardens. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that seemed to press against the very stones. "I once believed the same. That hierarchy was immutable. That silence was the price of position." He turned to face her fully. "But I have lived long enough to understand that the most profound revolutions occur not in the public sphere, but in moments when one human being refuses to permit another's dignity to be diminished." "You speak as though you understand humiliation, Your Grace." "I understand the temptation toward invisibility," he said quietly. "I understand the desire to withdraw into one's station rather than risk further exposure. But I also understand that such withdrawal is a form of death while one yet draws breath." The rain continued its insistent percussion against the stone. Clara became acutely aware of the impropriety of the moment, alone with the Duke, unchaperoned, speaking of matters that transcended the ordinary boundaries of conversation between their stations. And yet, beneath the transgression lay something else, a sense of being seen, truly seen, perhaps for the first time in her life. "What will become of me?" Clara asked, her voice barely audible above the rain. "Mrs. Rensley will certainly have learned of the incident by now. My position—" "Your position," the Duke interrupted, "is secure. I have taken certain precautions." He reached into his overcoat and withdrew a letter, its seal already broken, its edges slightly damp from the rain. "This arrived at the household not an hour before the ball, a letter of recommendation, addressed to myself, from the Duchess of Ashford. She wrote at length regarding a young woman of exceptional discretion and intelligence, a woman worthy of employment, in a position of greater responsibility than common service." Clara's hands trembled as she accepted the letter. The Duchess of Ashford, a woman of considerable influence, whose name appeared in the society columns with regularity. How had the Duke— "I confess," he said, reading the confusion in her expression, "that I wrote the letter myself. The Duchess and I have an understanding regarding matters of discretion. Her signature, when the moment requires it, will be forthcoming. Your Grace, you cannot— the impropriety, the deception, can be far less damaging than the alternatives," he replied, with a firmness that left no room for argument. "I am, Miss Merrow, a man accustomed to the exercise of power. I have learned that power is most justly employed not in the perpetuation of cruelty, but in its redress." The Duke moved toward the arbor's edge, his silhouette framed against the rain-soaked darkness beyond. "Lady Honoria will doubtless observe my absence from the ballroom. By morning she will have constructed an explanation that pleases her vanity. But tonight you are to return to the house through the eastern entrance. You will retire to your quarters. Tomorrow, you will inform Mrs. Rensley that you have secured employment elsewhere, a position befitting your merits. The letter will substantiate your claims. Why would you undertake such risk on behalf of someone you barely know? The Duke turned, and for a moment his expression became inscrutable. Because, Miss Merrow, there exists in this world a kind of cruelty that poisons everything it touches, and because I find myself at this juncture of my life unwilling to permit such poison to flourish unopposed. He extended his hand once more. Come, your dignity awaits, though perhaps not in the manner either of us anticipated. As Clara placed her hand in his, the rain seemed to pause, as though the very heavens held their breath at the improbability of the moment. The letter's seal bore the Duchess's authentic crest, an intricacy of gold and crimson that could not be forged without considerable artifice. Clara studied it by candlelight in her narrow servants' quarters, reading and rereading the elegant script that introduced her as a woman of remarkable discretion, possessed of both intellectual refinement and practical capability. The deception troubled her, and yet beneath the trouble lay a current of something else, possibility perhaps, or rebellion. Mrs. Rensley had accepted the news with a tightness around her mouth that suggested she suspected falsity without being able to prove it. You have given scant notice, the housekeeper had said, her fingers drumming against her ever-present ledger, and the Duchess's letter arrives with suspicious alacrity. Nevertheless, if Her Grace herself has made the request, I cannot dispute it. You will depart the household on the morrow. Clara had nodded, maintaining the composure that years of service had cultivated. But in the privacy of her quarters, she had wept again, this time not from humiliation but from the overwhelming complexity of being rescued by deception. She had not expected to hear from the Duke again, but the morning after her departure from Harrowcombe House brought a visitor who announced herself as Miss Catherine Whitmore, the Duchess's own companion, a woman of perhaps 40 years with kind eyes and a manner suggesting considerable intelligence. The Duchess has a proposition, Miss Whitmore explained, accepting the modest tea that Clara had prepared with trembling hands. She is, as you may know, a woman of progressive inclinations. She maintains a library of considerable scope and has recently conceived the desire to organize her collection in a manner befitting its significance. She requires an assistant, one with both practical capability and the intellectual foundation to understand bibliographic principles. But I am merely a housemaid, Clara protested. I possess no formal education in such matters. The Duchess believes you to be capable of acquiring such knowledge, Miss Whitmore replied with a gentle smile, and I am to serve as your pedagogue during the interim. You will reside in the Duchess's household at Ashford Park, assume the position of library assistant, and undertake a course of study designed to equip you for the role. The salary, I might add, exceeds considerably what you earned in service. Clara's world, which had seemed immutable for so long, suddenly seemed plastic, capable of transformation, of becoming something other than what it had been. The Duchess's household proved to be a revelation. Ashford Park sprawled across gardens so extensive that one could lose oneself for hours among its paths and hidden grottos. The library occupied an entire wing, 2 stories of shelved books, leather-bound volumes that smelled of age and knowledge, manuscripts arranged with a care that suggested reverence for their contents, and there, amid the carefully organized chaos of the collection, Clara discovered something she had not known she lacked, a sense of purpose that transcended the mere performance of duty. Miss Whitmore proved to be both exacting and patient. She taught Clara the principles of cataloguing, the proper handling of fragile bindings, the art of preservation, but she also taught her to read with intention, to understand not merely the words upon a page, but the ideas they conveyed, the beauty they possessed. The mind, Miss Whitmore would say, setting aside a particularly exquisite volume of poetry, is the only genuinely aristocratic thing a woman can possess. Station may be granted by circumstance, but intelligence, true intellectual capacity, that is earned through discipline and intention. It was during the 3rd week of her residence at Ashford Park that the Duke appeared. Clara was seated in the library's upper gallery, carefully rebinding a volume of Donne's sonnets when she became aware of his presence. He stood at the gallery's threshold, still dressed in the elegant severity that seemed to be his habitual uniform, his grey eyes observing her with an intensity that made her hands still upon the leather binding. Miss Whitmore informs me that you have made considerable progress, he said, descending the narrow stairs that led to her workspace. The Duchess is reportedly quite satisfied with both your competence and your intellectual appetite. I have endeavored to prove worthy of her faith, Your Grace, Clara replied, setting down her tools with careful deliberation, though I confess I remained uncertain of your involvement in the affair until Miss Whitmore made certain implications clear. The Duke moved closer, examining the volume she had been rebinding. Don, an interesting selection. He writes of love with an intensity that transcends the conventional sentimentality of his era. He writes of souls as well as hearts, Clara observed, surprised by her own boldness. There is a recognition in his verses that love is not merely a matter of attraction, but of mutual understanding, a meeting of minds that precedes any more physical acknowledgement. The Duke's lips curved in something that resembled satisfaction. Precisely. You understand the essential argument of the man, that true intimacy requires intellectual parity, not merely social conformity. He set down the volume and turned to face her fully. The afternoon light streaming through the library windows caught the sharp planes of his features, lending him an almost sculptural quality. I owe you an explanation, Miss Merrow, he said quietly. My interference in your circumstances was driven not by charity, though I do not scorn such impulses. It was driven by recognition, the recognition that Lady Honoria's cruelty had exposed something I could no longer ignore about myself, that I had chosen silence in the face of injustice, that I had permitted hierarchy to dictate morality rather than permitting morality to inform hierarchy. You have done more than sufficient, Your Grace. I find myself content here, purposeful even. And yet, he said, his voice dropping to a register that seemed to encompass considerable tenderness, I find myself possessed of the desire to ensure that your contentment is not merely the satisfaction of employment, but of being valued, truly valued, for the entirety of what you are. Clara's breath seemed to halt within her chest. She became acutely aware of the impropriety of the moment, standing so close to him, in the relative privacy of the library gallery, with his gaze fixed upon her with an intensity that transcended the boundaries of proper social interaction. Your Grace, she began, but her voice seemed inadequate to the complexity of what she wished to express. Would it offend your sensibilities, he interrupted, if I were to call upon you again, not in any official capacity, but simply as one reader of literature might call upon another, with the intention of engaging in substantive discourse? I would welcome such calls, Clara replied, and in her own voice she heard something unfamiliar, a kind of courage that suggested she was becoming not merely the recipient of the Duke's kindness, but an active participant in her own transformation. Autumn yielded to the first frosts of November, and with the changing season came a transformation in the delicate equilibrium that had sustained Clara's newfound existence. The Duke's visits to Ashford Park had become regularized, occurring with such consistency that the Duchess herself had begun to regard the arrangement with an air of benign acknowledgement that suggested she understood far more than propriety allowed her to articulate. It was during one such visit, as Clara and the Duke stood together in the library's quieter alcove, examining a recently acquired manuscript of Wordsworth's poetry, that Miss Whitmore entered with an expression of unmistakable concern. I have received word from the village, she said, her usual composure fractured by evident distress. There is a matter of some delicacy that requires immediate address. The Duke set down the manuscript with deliberate care. Speak plainly, Miss Whitmore. Whatever the concern, it will benefit from directness. The household staff at Harrowcombe House have apparently begun to circulate a narrative regarding Miss Merrow's rather precipitous departure, Miss Whitmore explained, her gaze fixed upon a point somewhere beyond the library windows. The story has evolved, as such tales invariably do. It is now being suggested that Miss Merrow's removal from the household occurred under circumstances of considerable impropriety, that she had engaged in conduct unbecoming a servant, and that the Duchess's charitable intervention was undertaken merely to shield her from the consequences of her own indiscretion. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. The careful architecture of her redemption, built so painstakingly across these weeks of study and genuine employment, seemed suddenly fragile as frost upon a windowpane. Who perpetuates this fiction? The Duke demanded, and his voice carried an edge that suggested steel beneath civility. Mrs. Rensley, primarily, Miss Whitmore replied, with evident reluctance, though the narrative has been considerably embellished by others. The most pernicious version suggests that Miss Merrow engaged in theft, that she absconded with some article of value from the household, and that her departure was arranged precisely to prevent prosecution. The accusation hung in the library's quiet air like a physical presence. Clara's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the reading table beside her. "It is manifestly false," the Duke said, though his tone suggested he required no confirmation of this fact. "Miss Merrow has been at Ashford Park, under the Duchess's direct observation, engaged in honest employment. The chronology itself refutes these allegations." "The chronology may be clear to us," Miss Whitmore observed gently, "but such facts rarely pierce the armor of settled conviction. The servants' networks have already constructed a narrative that satisfies their desire for explanation. Miss Merrow's elevated circumstances are being interpreted as further evidence of impropriety, that she has somehow secured position through means other than merit." Clara found her voice, though it emerged smaller than she would have wished. "It is as though no action I undertake can escape the taint of that initial humiliation. I am to be eternally defined by the moment in which I was rendered visible through cruelty." The Duke moved toward her, his expression grave with something that resembled fury, though the fury seemed directed not toward Clara, but toward the systemic forces that had constructed such an impossible situation. "You will not bear this alone," he said quietly, "nor will we permit this slander to persist unchallenged." But the challenge, Clara soon discovered, required a delicacy that transcended simple denial. The rumors had taken root in the soil of social speculation, and uprooting them required not merely the assertion of truth, but the construction of an alternative narrative sufficiently compelling to displace the existing falsehood. The Duke's response was characteristically methodical. Within a fortnight, the Duchess had arranged for Clara to be presented at a tea attended by several women of considerable social influence. Clara was introduced not merely as the library assistant, but as the Duchess's special protégée, a young woman whose intellectual accomplishments had earned her a position of genuine responsibility within the household. The presentation was calculated with precision. Clara was dressed in a gown of soft grey wool, elegantly but not ostentatiously appointed, her appearance conveying respectability rather than presumption. She was situated at the Duchess's right hand, and when conversation turned to the matter of her employment, the Duchess addressed the assembled company with a firmness that brooked no contradiction. "I have observed Miss Merrow's capabilities across these weeks of employment," the Duchess declared, setting down her teacup with deliberate finality. "She possesses both intellectual rigor and exemplary character. Any suggestion to the contrary derives from sources seeking to diminish what they do not understand, the capacity of an industrious woman to elevate herself through legitimate means." The weight of the Duchess's position and confidence seemed to settle the matter, at least in those quarters where opinion held genuine consequence. The rumors did not cease entirely, such things never do, but they acquired a different tenor. Doubt began to infiltrate the certainty of the original narrative. It was during this period of partial redemption that the Duke found Clara alone in the library. Late one evening, when the household had largely retired, she was shelving volumes by candlelight, a task that had become almost meditative in its familiarity when he appeared at the library's threshold. He wore neither evening coat nor formal attire, but rather a dark dressing gown that suggested he had emerged from his guest quarters with a purpose that transcended convention. "I have been informed that the Duchess intends to host a significant gathering in December," he said without preamble, "an assembly of considerable social weight, intellectuals, patrons of the arts, women of influence and discretion. You will be presented to this assembly as the Duchess's library assistant and intellectual companion. The position is genuine, your capabilities are authentic. But I will not conceal from you that the timing is calculated to further establish your legitimacy in the minds of those whose opinions carry consequence." "You manipulate society on my behalf," Clara observed, though there was no accusation in her tone, merely a kind of wondering recognition of the complexity of her situation. "I exercise such influence as I possess toward the rectification of injustice," the Duke replied. He moved closer, and in the candlelight his expression revealed layers of careful control overlaying deeper currents of genuine concern. "I confess, however, that my motivations are not entirely altruistic. It would be dishonest to suggest otherwise." "What then drives you beyond charitable impulse, Your Grace?" He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed upon her face with an intensity that seemed to penetrate beyond the surface of her features. "The desire," he said finally, "to ensure that a woman whose dignity I recognize and whose person I have come to He paused, seeming to struggle with the inadequacy of language. That is to say, I find myself wishing to construct a future in which your happiness is not contingent upon the goodwill of others, but rooted in the genuine foundation of your own worth and accomplishment. Clara's heart seemed to alter its rhythm within her chest. She understood in that moment that they had crossed some invisible threshold, that the interaction between them had transformed from one of rescuer and rescued into something far more complex and perilous. "Your Grace," she whispered, "you must not speak such things. The impropriety—" "I am aware of the impropriety," he interrupted gently. "I have been acutely aware of it for some weeks now, and yet I find myself increasingly unable to maintain the fiction that our association is merely one of charitable impulse or intellectual companionship." The candles flickered, casting shadows that seemed to render the library a space untethered from ordinary reality. "What do you wish from me?" Clara asked, her voice barely audible. "At present," the Duke replied with a softness that somehow transcended the careful control of his usual manner, "merely your continued presence and the knowledge that you understand, truly understand, that you are no longer defined by the moment of your humiliation. You are becoming something far more significant, and I find myself honored to bear witness to that transformation." December arrived with snow that transformed Ashford Park into a landscape of crystalline beauty. The approaching assembly occupied considerable attention within the household, as servants and tradespeople busied themselves with preparations that suggested an event of genuine consequence. Yet for Clara, the impending gathering represented far more than a social engagement. It constituted a threshold beyond which there could be no return to the relative safety of her previous anonymity. The Duke's visits had become more frequent, though they maintained the veneer of propriety that Miss Whitmore and the Duchess studiously preserved. Yet in the intervals of conversation, in the moments when his hand might brush hers while passing a volume, in the deliberate intensity of his gaze when he believed himself unobserved, Clara recognized the presence of something far more profound than mere friendship or intellectual companionship. She had begun to experience the peculiar torment of a heart engaged in directions that propriety forbade her to acknowledge openly. It was on a particularly cold evening, as snow fell in thick, silent abundance beyond the library windows, that the Duke produced a letter, its envelope bearing a crest that Clara recognized with a start of apprehension. "This arrived at my estate this morning," he said, his expression unreadable as he extended the missive toward her. "It is addressed to myself, though the matter concerns you directly." Clara accepted the letter with trembling fingers. The seal bore the emblem of Harrowcombe House, Mrs. Rensley's seal, though the handwriting proved to be that of a solicitor. Her eyes moved across the page, gathering fragments of meaning. Upon the matter of certain household articles, discrepancies in the accounts, Miss Clara Merrow's period of employment, restitution expected, legal proceedings should remediation prove insufficient. The breath seemed to abandon her lungs entirely. "It is a fabrication," the Duke said quietly, observing her distress with evident concern. "A final attempt by Mrs. Rensley to inflict damage upon your reputation. The solicitor has been instructed, through channels that guarantee professional discretion, to undertake an investigation of Harrowcombe House's accounts. I expect that within a fortnight we shall discover that the discrepancies Mrs. Rensley alleges derive not from any action of yours, but from her own systematic mismanagement of household expenditures." "How can you be certain?" Clara whispered. "Because I am not unaccustomed to the exercise of power," the Duke replied, with a coldness that suggested he had engaged in far more complex maneuvers than this. "And because the pattern of her accusations reveals their falsity. She accuses you of theft, yet provides no inventory of missing items. She suggests financial irregularity, yet offers no documentation substantiating her claims. It is the accusation of one whose position is becoming precarious and who seeks to deflect attention toward others." He took the letter from her trembling hands and set it aside with deliberate dismissal. "You will not concern yourself with this matter. I have undertaken to see it resolved. What I require from you is your commitment to appear at the Duchess's assembly with precisely the composure and grace that you have demonstrated across these weeks of residence. Allow Mrs. Rensley's desperate machinations to fade into the insignificance they deserve." And yet, despite the Duke's assurances, Clara found herself haunted by the letter's implications. It seemed to suggest that her redemption remained contingent, that the ground upon which she stood, however apparently solid, might yet crumble at any moment. The assembly itself transpired on an evening of rare clarity, the snow having ceased, and the stars emerging with unusual brilliance. Ashford Park's grand drawing rooms blazed with candlelight, and the assembled company represented perhaps 50 individuals of considerable influence and accomplishment, women whose names appeared in the society pages alongside references to their intellectual patronage, men whose scholarly work or artistic achievement had earned them prominence beyond the mere accident of their birth. The Duchess, radiant in deep crimson silk, presented Clara to the assembly with a deliberateness that suggested this moment had been planned with considerable precision. "I wish to introduce Miss Clara Merrow," she announced to the assembled company, "who has become my library assistant and intellectual companion. She brings to that position not merely practical competence, but genuine scholarly refinement. I have been endeavoring for some years to find an individual capable of assisting me in the organization of my collection, and I am most gratified to have found in Miss Merrow precisely the combination of capabilities and character that such an undertaking demands." The introduction provoked a gratifying response. Several of the assembled women came forward to engage Clara in conversation, inquiring about her literary preferences, her opinions on recent publications, her thoughts on the matter of female education, and Clara, drawing upon the confidence that weeks of genuine intellectual engagement had cultivated, found herself capable of articulating observations that seemed to warrant the respect of these accomplished individuals. The Duke had positioned himself across the drawing room, observing the proceedings with an expression of careful neutrality. Yet when their eyes met, which occurred with increasing frequency across the evening, Clara recognized in his gaze something that transcended mere approval. It suggested possession, perhaps, or aspiration, or the careful restraint of desires that propriety forbade him to express openly. It was near midnight, as the assembly was beginning to disperse, that the Duke engineered a moment of relative privacy. Clara found herself separated from the main body of the gathering, standing in the library's shadowed alcove, when he appeared beside her with the ease of long familiarity. "You were magnificent this evening," he said softly. "Every woman of genuine intelligence present recognized your worth, and every observer of the proceedings understood that your presence here is not a matter of charity, but of earned position." "I am grateful to you, Your Grace," Clara replied, her voice barely audible above the distant sounds of the departing guests. "For everything, for the intervention, the employment, the opportunity to become—" "Do not thank me," he interrupted, his voice dropping to a register that seemed to encompass considerable emotion held in careful check. "What I have undertaken on your behalf has been driven by motivations that extend far beyond altruism. I find myself, Miss Merrow, in a situation of considerable complexity. I possess both the desire and the capacity to ensure your happiness and security. Yet I am constrained by considerations of propriety and station that make the open expression of my intentions impossible." Clara's heart seemed to halt within her chest. She understood perfectly what he was suggesting, yet the very understanding seemed to render the moment simultaneously transcendent and impossible. "Your Grace, you must not—" "I know," he replied with a softness that somehow conveyed more intensity than any expression of passion could have accomplished. "I am acutely aware of the impropriety of my feelings and the impossibility of their legitimate expression. Yet I cannot conceal from you that you have become, across these weeks, essential to my conception of a future that possesses meaning beyond the mere accumulation of power and position." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, a silver signet ring, its surface bearing an intricate pattern that suggested considerable age and craftsmanship. "This," he said, "belonged to my mother. She was a woman who defied considerable social pressure to marry for love rather than advantage. I have carried it these many years as a reminder that some acts of rebellion, though they invite condemnation from without, possess a validity that transcends the judgment of society." He pressed the ring into Clara's hand, closing her fingers gently around it. "I place this in your keeping not as a proposal, which propriety forbids me to make openly, but as a pledge that I am committed to ensuring your future, that my feelings for you extend beyond the boundaries of conventional propriety, and that I am prepared to undertake whatever actions may be necessary to transform the impossible into the achievable." The ring seemed to burn within her palm, heavy with significance that transcended its material substance. "What are you asking of me?" Clara whispered. "Nothing that you are not prepared to give," the Duke replied. "Only your trust and your continued presence in my life as circumstances allow. The rest, the resolution of impediments, the construction of a future we might share. These matters I undertake to manage through whatever means prove necessary. The December morning that brought the solicitor's report to the Duke also brought with it a crystalline clarity regarding the true nature of Mrs. Rensley's fabrications. The investigation, conducted with meticulous precision across the accounts of Harrowcombe House across the previous 5 years, revealed not minor discrepancies, but systematic embezzlement of considerable magnitude. The housekeeper had been siphoning household funds, ostensibly for repairs and maintenance that had never been undertaken, for supplies never received, for services never rendered. The amounts, accumulated across years of careful dissimulation, totaled a sum substantial enough to constitute grand larceny. The evidence was irrefutable, documented in her own hand across ledgers that she had failed to adequately conceal. The Duke received the report in his study at Ashford Park, where he had remained as a guest for the preceding week, a duration that the Duchess had begun to regard with an air of amusement, suggesting she recognized far more than propriety allowed her to articulate. He read the solicitor's findings in silence, his expression unreadable, then set the document aside and composed a letter in response. Within days, Mrs. Rensley had been dismissed from her position and confronted with evidence of her crimes. The choice before her was presented with a kind of aristocratic courtesy that somehow rendered it more devastating than any overt threats could have accomplished. Either she would depart the household quietly, her embezzlement addressed through private settlement, or the matter would be placed in the hands of the magistrate. She had chosen to depart. The news reached Clara through Miss Whitmore, who had received it from a correspondent in the village, with that particular efficiency that characterized the servants' intelligence networks. And with the news came a liberation, though it proved to be more complex in its implications than simple relief. The accusation, the Duke explained to Clara when they found themselves together in the library some days later, has been entirely discredited. Moreover, the true nature of Mrs. Rensley's crimes has become known. Any suggestion that you bore responsibility for household deficiencies will now be recognized as the desperate prevarication of a woman whose position was already compromised. But the cost, Clara replied quietly, her eyes fixed upon the volume before her without truly seeing it. You have undertaken to protect me, and in doing so, you have created an enmity with a woman who might have otherwise departed your service uncontested. Should she attempt to disseminate knowledge of her crimes, the scandal will touch me far less than it will touch her, the Duke interrupted. I am not without resources, Miss Merrow, nor am I unaccustomed to the management of social consequence. Moreover, I find myself increasingly indifferent to the judgment of society regarding matters that concern my personal conduct. The protection of your reputation and the clarification of your character have become necessities that transcend considerations of my own social position. He moved closer, and the candlelight caught the sharp planes of his features, rendering him almost ethereal in his intensity. I have made certain decisions across these weeks that have irrevocable consequences. I have exercised my position and my resources in ways that place considerable reliance upon your continuing presence in my life. I do not make such investments lightly, nor do I undertake them without full recognition of their implications. What are you saying, Your Grace? Clara asked, though she believed she understood perfectly. I am saying, he replied, with a deliberateness that seemed to encompass considerable emotion held in careful restraint, that I am prepared to make a proposal that society will inevitably condemn, that I am prepared to accept the consequences of that condemnation, and that I require from you only the honesty to acknowledge whether the feelings that I have observed in your expression across these weeks correspond to sentiments that might permit us to contemplate a future together. Clara's throat seemed to constrict. The moment toward which weeks of careful tension had been building had arrived, and with it came the simultaneous recognition of its perfection and its profound impossibility. Your Grace, she whispered, such a proposal would constitute a scandal of immense proportions. You are a duke. I am a woman of no family, no property, no social standing. The world would condemn such a union as a descent into impropriety, unforgivable in a man of your position. The world condemns much that deserves celebration, the Duke replied coldly. I have spent my life according my actions to the judgment of society, and I have discovered that such conformity purchases not respect, but merely a kind of comfortable invisibility. I find myself at an age and a position where I am willing to exchange that invisibility for the opportunity to construct a life possessing genuine meaning. He reached toward her, his hand trembling slightly as he extended it into the space between them. I am aware that you require time to contemplate such a proposition. I am aware that acceptance would require you to forfeit the position you have so carefully constructed here and to assume instead a role that would expose you to considerable scrutiny and potential condemnation. These are not trivial considerations, and I do not expect an immediate response. He paused, his expression shifting into something that suggested profound vulnerability beneath the careful control of his usual demeanor. However, he continued, I find myself compelled to inform you that I have undertaken a commitment that requires immediate declaration. The Duchess has arranged for the assembly to be followed in January by a presentation at court, an event that will introduce you to society at large, not merely as her companion, but as a woman of intellectual accomplishment deserving of recognition. I have sponsored this presentation through channels that render it not merely possible, but inevitable. You have done what? Clara demanded, her voice rising in a combination of gratitude, alarm, and something that resembled exasperation. I have exercised my influence, the Duke replied with evident satisfaction, to ensure that you will be presented to society in a manner that establishes your legitimacy beyond any possible question. This presentation will constitute a public declaration of faith in your character and your capabilities. It will render speculation regarding your origins and your prior circumstances essentially irrelevant, for it will establish you as a woman worthy of aristocratic recognition. He moved toward the window, his silhouette framed against the snow-covered landscape beyond. I do not undertake such actions without full awareness of their implications. The presentation will inevitably prompt speculation regarding the nature of my interest in your welfare. Society will construct narratives, some malicious, some merely prurient, but the narratives will be constructed upon a foundation of your demonstrated worth rather than upon the defamation that Mrs. Rensley attempted to circulate. Your Grace, Clara said, her voice steadier now, though her hands still trembled with the magnitude of what he was articulating. You speak as though you are prepared to sacrifice your reputation upon the altar of my redemption. No man in your position would undertake such a sacrifice without expecting some reciprocal obligation. He turned to face her, and his expression revealed layers of careful vulnerability. The only obligation I expect, he said quietly, is honesty. Tell me that you do not regard the feelings I have articulated with contempt. Tell me that the possibility of a future constructed together does not horrify you. Tell me that you understand that what I am offering is not charity, but partnership, an exchange of equals, though the world will never permit us the luxury of that equality being openly acknowledged. Clara found herself moving toward him, drawn by forces that transcended the careful boundaries she had maintained. She extended her hand, and he took it with a gentleness that contradicted the intensity of his gaze. I cannot accept any of this, she said, though the words seemed to contradict the warmth of her touch within his grasp. It would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. You are asking me to accept a future constructed upon deception, the presentation at court, the fabricated narrative of my origins, the careful manipulation of society's perception. I am asking you, he interrupted, his voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to encompass considerable emotion, to recognize that society itself is a construction of such deceptions, that the hierarchy upon which it rests is maintained through precisely such careful manipulations. I'm asking you to acknowledge that the woman you have become across these weeks of genuine accomplishment deserves recognition, that the world will not voluntarily grant her, and I am asking you to allow me to ensure that such recognition is forthcoming. He raised her hand to his lips, the gesture both achingly tender and entirely improper. Everything I have done, Miss Merrow, has been undertaken with the intention of transforming the impossible into the achievable. I cannot offer you legitimacy through marriage, not yet, not while the world remains as rigid as it currently is, but I can offer you security, recognition, and the certainty that your future will be determined by your own will rather than by the accidents of your birth or the malice of those whose power you have inadvertently challenged. Clara understood in that moment that she stood at a threshold as significant as the one she had crossed on the night of Lady Honoria's cruelty. The choice before her was equally immense. To accept a future that society would inevitably condemn, constructed upon foundations of careful deception and personal sacrifice, or to withdraw from the intensity of the Duke's regard and maintain the safety of her hard-won position, isolated and respectable. "I will attend the presentation at court," she said quietly. "I will accept the recognition you have orchestrated. But I must know, what is the end point of this arrangement? What do you envision as the ultimate resolution?" The Duke's expression became inscrutable once more. "That," he said carefully, "depends upon circumstances that remain, as yet, beyond my capacity to control. But I am prepared to undertake whatever actions may be necessary to ensure that your happiness is not merely a temporary respite, but a permanent condition." He released her hand with evident reluctance. "Now you should retire. The hour grows late, and we must both maintain the appearance of propriety, however carefully we work to subvert it." As Clara made her way through the darkened corridors of Ashford Park toward her quarters, the silver signet ring that she had concealed within her bodice seemed to pulse with a warmth that transcended its material substance. She understood that she had crossed some invisible threshold, that the careful distance between rescue and ruin had narrowed to a point where the distinction had become essentially meaningless, and she recognized, with a clarity that was both exhilarating and terrifying, that she possessed neither the will nor the desire to return to the safe, invisible existence from which the Duke had lifted her. January arrived with a rigor that seemed to match the intensity of the preparations undertaken for Clara's presentation at court. The gown had been commissioned from London's most accomplished seamstress, a creation of extraordinary delicacy in pale silver silk, its construction designed to convey elegance rather than ostentation, refinement rather than presumption. The Duchess had insisted upon every detail with the precision of one accustomed to orchestrating social moments of considerable consequence. "You will be presented," the Duchess had explained, "not as a novelty or a charity case, but as a woman of genuine intellectual accomplishment and refined sensibility. Your bearing must reflect neither uncertainty nor arrogance, but rather the composed confidence of one who has earned recognition through merit." The presentation itself transpired on an evening when the court blazed with a brilliance that seemed almost excessive in its lavishness. Hundreds of candles illuminated the grand ballroom where the assembled aristocracy of England gathered, women in gowns of such complexity that they seemed to constitute entire architectural undertakings, men in dress uniforms bearing decorations that testified to generations of inherited consequence. Clara's heart had seemed to cease its regular rhythm as she waited in the anteroom reserved for those being presented. For her moment of introduction, the Duchess stood beside her, a figure of such unshakable composure that her mere presence seemed to project confidence onto those within her immediate proximity. "Remember," the Duchess had whispered as the moment approached, "that you are not entering this ballroom to beg for acceptance. You are entering to demonstrate that acceptance is precisely what you deserve. Carry yourself accordingly." The moment came. Clara was announced, Miss Clara Merrow, presented by Her Grace the Duchess of Ashford, and she descended into the ballroom with a composure that seemed to emanate from some source deeper than her own nervous system. The gown flowed around her like spun moonlight. Her bearing reflected the weeks of careful preparation, and as she made her curtsy before the assembled nobility, she recognized in the faces around her not the contempt she had feared, but rather a kind of curious attention that suggested genuine interest. The evening proceeded with a succession of introductions that blurred together into an abstract panorama of titles, accomplishments, and carefully calibrated remarks. Women inquired about her background, which the Duchess navigated with the ease of long practice, emphasizing Clara's intellectual pursuits and her contributions to the organization of her library. Men regarded her with a mixture of interest and caution that suggested they recognized her unusual position without fully understanding its implications. And then, as the evening reached its crescendo, an extraordinary thing occurred. The Duke, who had remained throughout the presentation in the background, observing rather than participating, his presence both commanding and somehow unobtrusive, approached Clara with a directness that transcended the careful negotiations of propriety that had characterized their previous interactions. He bowed with perfect formality, then extended his hand toward her with an unmistakable gesture of invitation. "Miss Merrow," he said, his voice carrying across the ballroom with a clarity that suggested deliberate projection, "would you do me the considerable honor of permitting me to lead you in the next dance?" The request itself was not extraordinary. Men and women danced together constantly throughout such gatherings, yet the manner in which the Duke made the request, combined with the significance of his position, and the widely recognized attentiveness he had demonstrated toward Clara across the evening rendered the moment charged with implications that transcended mere social convention. A ripple of attention moved through the assembled company. Eyes turned. Whispers began their inevitable propagation. And Clara, understanding perfectly what the Duke was undertaking, accepted his hand with a serenity that masked the tempest of emotion within her chest. The orchestra, as though responding to some signal imperceptible to ordinary observation, began a waltz, a composition of extraordinary beauty that seemed to capture something essential about the moment. And as the Duke drew her into the rhythm of the dance, their movement through the space of the ballroom acquired a quality that transcended the merely physical. "You are magnificent," he whispered, his voice audible only to her amidst the swelling music and the surrounding conversations. "Every eye observes you. Every mind constructs narratives regarding your presence here, your appearance, the evident favor with which I regard you." "Your Grace," Clara replied, her voice trembling slightly despite her composed exterior, "you are placing both our reputations in considerable jeopardy." "I am aware," he responded, executing a turn that brought them into the light of the candelabra overhead. "I am in fact undertaking far more than merely dancing with a woman whose company I value. I am making a declaration, one that society will inevitably interpret as a proclamation of intentions that extend beyond the mere social interaction of this evening." They moved through the ballroom, and Clara became acutely conscious of the intensity with which they were observed. She recognized in the faces around them the machinery of speculation, the careful analysis, the construction of narratives, the assessment of implications. "What do you intend?" she asked, her eyes fixed upon his with a directness that transcended the ordinary protocols of their interaction. "What I intend," the Duke replied, "has evolved considerably across the weeks of your residence at Ashford Park. I have undertaken a commitment that requires public acknowledgement, though the full implications of that commitment cannot be disclosed at present." The music reached its crescendo, and the Duke executed a final turn that seemed to position them at the precise center of the ballroom, the point at which they were most visible to the assembled company. "I wish to inform you," he continued, his voice dropping to a register that suggested considerable emotion held in careful restraint, "that I have received word that the matter of your legitimacy, the question of your origins and your prior circumstances, has been addressed through certain channels. The woman you were before your arrival at Ashford Park has been, in a sense, reconstituted through documentation that establishes a narrative more consistent with your current position." Clara's breath seemed to halt within her chest. She understood what he was articulating, that he had undertaken to fabricate an entirely new history for her, one that would render her acceptance into society not merely tolerable, but inevitable. "The particulars need not concern you at present," the Duke continued, "but I wish for you to understand that every obstacle that might have impeded your full integration into society has been systematically addressed. You are no longer the woman who fled a ballroom in tears. You are a woman of demonstrated accomplishment, recognized by the Duchess of Ashford, presented at court, and—" The music ended. They ceased their movement, and in the moment of stillness that followed, the Duke brought her hand to his lips with a gesture that was both achingly tender and unmistakably public, and regarded by myself with a depth of feeling that transcends the boundaries of proper social interaction, he concluded. The ballroom erupted into a chorus of whispers. The Duchess, observing from her vantage point near the entrance, allowed herself the smallest smile, a gesture suggesting she had anticipated precisely this moment and regarded it with approval rather than disapproval. In the weeks that followed, the implications of that dance became increasingly evident. The Duke's evident regard for Clara transmuted the entire narrative surrounding her presence in society. What might have remained a scandal, a woman of unknown origins elevated to prominence through aristocratic patronage, instead became a matter of romantic interest. The speculation regarding the Duke's intentions proliferated across the drawing rooms of London with the inevitability of spring's arrival. Yet the Duke, in a move that confounded those who anticipated an announcement of engagement, maintained a careful distance. He called upon Clara at Ashford Park with regular precision, but always in the presence of others. He engaged her in conversation of obvious substance and genuine intellectual content. He demonstrated regard that was unmistakable, yet he made no formal declaration. It was during one of his visits in early February that he produced a letter, this one bearing the seal of the Archbishop of Canterbury. "The documentation of your revised origins has been completed," he explained, presenting the letter to Clara with the care one might employ when handling something of considerable fragility. Your birth records, appropriately amended and authenticated, now establish you as the orphaned daughter of a clergyman of respectable standing, a background that renders your education in certain intellectual disciplines entirely explicable, and your presence in cultivated society perfectly reasonable. You have corrupted official records, Clara said quietly, examining the letter with a mixture of horror and gratitude. The cost of such an undertaking is insignificant compared to the cost of allowing your happiness to be contingent upon the accidents of your birth, the Duke interrupted. I have made peace with the moral compromises inherent in such actions. The world itself is constructed upon deceptions and carefully maintained fictions. I have merely ensured that your fiction is less damaging to your genuine character than the truth would have been. He moved closer, and his expression revealed the exhaustion that had become increasingly evident across his features, the toll of maintaining his public composure while simultaneously undertaking these elaborate arrangements behind the scenes. I must inform you, he continued, that certain circumstances have developed that require my attention at my estate. I will be departing Ashford Park for a duration of some weeks. I am entrusting to the Duchess's care the final arrangements for your establishment in society. When I return, all impediments to our future, whether social, legal, or circumstantial, will have been systematically addressed. What circumstances? Clara asked, her voice edged with alarm. What has occurred? Nothing that should concern you directly, the Duke replied, though his eyes suggested otherwise. Merely certain matters of estate business that require my personal intervention. You are to remain at Ashford Park, continue your employment in the library, and permit the Duchess to continue her careful management of your social integration. He took her hand, and the contact conveyed a tenderness that seemed almost unbearable in its intensity. When I return, Miss Merrow, we will address the question that has suspended itself between us for these months past. Until that time, I ask only that you remain patient and trust that every action I undertake is calculated toward a future in which we might finally be permitted, by law, by society, by circumstance, to acknowledge openly what propriety has thus far compelled us to conceal. The weeks following the Duke's departure from Ashford Park acquired a strange quality, a suspension that seemed to transcend mere temporal progression. Clara continued her work in the library with increased intensity, as though the organization of knowledge might somehow compensate for the absence of the man who had so thoroughly disordered her emotional equilibrium. Miss Whitmore observed this intensification with gentle concern, but offered neither commentary nor advice. It was during the 4th week of his absence that the Duchess summoned Clara to her private chambers. The summons itself was unusual. Their interactions typically occurred in the more public spaces of the household, where propriety could be more easily maintained. The Duchess's sitting room, however, was decorated with a feminine refinement that suggested intimacy and trust. I have received word from the Duke, the Duchess announced without preamble, gesturing Clara toward a chair positioned opposite her own, through channels that ensure discretion, naturally. The circumstances that necessitated his absence have proven more complex than he initially anticipated. Clara's heart seemed to contract with apprehension. Has something occurred? Is he well? He is well in body, though his situation presents certain challenges of considerable delicacy, the Duchess replied, her expression becoming thoughtful. There is a matter concerning his estate, a legal complication arising from his late mother's will that has become subject to dispute from certain quarters. Nothing that threatens his position fundamentally, but rather something that requires his personal attention and certain arrangements that cannot be delegated to solicitors without considerable risk. I do not fully comprehend, Clara said quietly. The Duchess set down her teacup with deliberate care. The Duke's mother, as you may know, was a woman of considerable independence and unconventional sensibility. In her will, she made certain provisions that have become subject to challenge by relatives who believe themselves disadvantaged by her choices. The matter is not merely one of property and inheritance, but of principle. The question of whether a woman's expressed wishes regarding the disposition of her own wealth can be sustained against the legal challenges of her disappointed heirs. She paused, observing Clara with an intensity that suggested she was gauging the younger woman's capacity to comprehend what was being articulated. I mention this matter, the Duchess continued, because the resolution of this legal complication has acquired particular significance regarding the Duke's own circumstances. Certain arrangements that he has envisioned, arrangements that concern you directly, cannot be properly established until this matter is settled. He has asked me to communicate to you that he is acutely aware of the temporal constraints imposed by society's willingness to tolerate an ambiguous situation, and that he is working with considerable urgency toward the resolution of these impediments. Clara felt the ground beneath her shift in subtle but unmistakable ways. What arrangements? What has the Duke undertaken on my behalf? The Duchess rose and moved toward her writing desk, from which she extracted a document of considerable formality. He has instructed me to provide you with this, a letter establishing a trust fund in your name, the principal derived from his own personal resources, established with sufficient generosity to render you financially independent of any other source of support. Clara accepted the document with hands that trembled visibly. The sums enumerated were staggering, amounts that suggested not merely comfortable security, but genuine wealth. I cannot accept this. It would constitute an impropriety of such magnitude that it would render my reputation entirely untenable. It is already established, the Duchess said gently. The trust has been formally constituted through legal channels. The documentation remains confidential, known only to the Duke's solicitors, myself, and now to you. Should circumstances develop in directions that neither the Duke nor I can anticipate, this financial establishment ensures that you will never again be rendered vulnerable through the accidents of economic necessity. She returned to her seat and fixed Clara with an expression of considerable gravity. I have known the Duke since his youth. I have observed his progression from a dutiful but emotionally constrained young man into someone capable of genuine feeling and authentic commitment. What he is undertaking on your behalf, the fabrication of your origins, the establishment of your financial independence, the careful orchestration of your social acceptance, these actions are not those of a man engaged in mere temporary infatuation. They are the actions of someone who has fundamentally reorganized his understanding of what constitutes a meaningful existence. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. I say this not to place you under obligation, but to ensure that you comprehend the gravity of the Duke's commitment. When he returns, as he inevitably shall, certain decisions will require your own clear understanding and voluntary consent. You cannot undertake such decisions from a position of emotional confusion or uncertainty regarding the depth of his regard. What is he asking of me? Clara whispered. That, the Duchess replied, is a matter he must address directly. I have been instructed only to ensure that you understand the framework within which his actions have been undertaken, and to communicate that your happiness, your genuine, sustained, deep happiness, has become the primary motivating force of his current endeavors. In the days that followed, Clara found herself increasingly preoccupied by the implications of what the Duchess had communicated. The trust fund, when she examined its particulars with trembling hands, established her as a woman of independent means, a status that fundamentally altered her relationship to society and to the Duke alike. She was no longer a woman who had been rescued from destitution. She was a woman who possessed the capacity to refuse the Duke's advances, should she choose to do so, the capacity to construct her own future independent of his influence. This recognition, rather than providing comfort, generated a complex mix of gratitude and apprehension. She understood that the Duke had deliberately created conditions that would ensure any future commitment between them rested upon genuine choice rather than economic necessity or social desperation. The generosity of the gesture was undeniable, and yet it also rendered the weight of her own responsibility for their future substantially more burdensome. It was in the 6th week of the Duke's absence that the letter arrived, bearing his personal seal and marked for her eyes alone. Miss Whitmore delivered it with a discretion that suggested she was aware of its nature without requiring confirmation. My dearest Clara, I trust this communication finds you in continuing health and improved spirits. The circumstances that have necessitated my absence have proven somewhat more protracted than I initially anticipated, though I perceive in the complications I have encountered a kind of perverse fortune. They have provided me with the temporal distance necessary to ensure that my own understanding of what I am proposing is neither confused by immediate emotion nor compromised by the urgency of proximity. I have instructed the Duchess to communicate to you certain matters regarding financial arrangements that I have undertaken on your behalf. I do so not as a means of purchasing obligation, but as a demonstration of my commitment to ensuring that any future you might construct with me rests upon genuine choice rather than economic necessity. I must be forthright with you regarding the circumstances that have occupied my attention these past weeks. The legal complication arising from my mother's will concerns more than merely the disposition of property. My mother, in her wisdom, established certain conditions regarding the future of my estate and my own capacity to undertake certain commitments. These conditions specified that I could not marry beneath my station without forfeiting a substantial portion of my inheritance. This was, I understand, a common provision in documents of that era, an attempt to ensure that matters of lineage and social position would not be compromised by emotional considerations. I have spent these past weeks undertaking legal action to challenge and overturn this provision. The grounds for such challenge rest upon the recognition that such conditions are fundamentally at odds with principles of personal liberty and the fundamental right of individuals to determine their own futures regardless of social hierarchy. The legal arguments have proven complex, but I am informed by my solicitors that there is a substantial probability of success. I mention this matter because I wish for you to understand that when I return to Ashford Park, which shall occur within a fortnight, I intend to propose to you in terms that society will be compelled to recognize as legitimate, not as a seduction into impropriety, but as a formal declaration of intention that acknowledges the profound transformation that has occurred within me across the months of your presence in my life. I do not know whether you will accept such a proposal. I am aware that what I am undertaking represents a substantial departure from the social conventions that have governed my entire existence. I am aware that marriage to me would expose you to considerable scrutiny and potential condemnation from those who regard such a union as a breach of the fundamental hierarchies that organize society. What I am asking of you is neither obedience nor gratitude, but honesty. When I return and when I make this formal declaration, I ask only that you respond with truthfulness regarding your own heart and your own desires. If you cannot envision a future with me, if the accumulated weight of my actions on your behalf has rendered you unable to regard me with anything other than obligation, then I will accept your refusal with grace and will ensure that your independence, both financial and social, remains absolute. But if you find, as I have found, that the connection between us has transcended the ordinary boundaries of social interaction and touched something essential in both our natures, then perhaps we might together undertake the considerable task of reconstructing society's understanding of what constitutes a legitimate and meaningful union. Your devoted servant, A. Clara, read the letter multiple times, each reading revealing new layers of complexity and commitment. She understood that the Duke was offering her something far more significant than marriage. He was offering her a partnership that would require her to accept not merely his love, but also the weight of his rebellion against the systems that had governed his entire existence. And as she held his letter in her trembling hands, she recognized with perfect clarity that she could not refuse him. Not because she was obligated, but because the depth of her own feeling had come to match the intensity of his commitment. The Duke's return to Ashford Park occurred on an afternoon of such unexpected mildness that it seemed to presage spring's imminent arrival, despite the calendar's insistence that winter had not yet entirely surrendered its dominion. Clara was working in the library's upper gallery when she became aware of the commotion below, the arrival of his carriage, the bustle of servants attending to his needs, the subtle shift in the household's atmosphere that his presence alone seemed to generate. She did not descend immediately. Instead, she remained among the shelves, allowing herself a moment to gather the considerable emotional resources that his proximity seemed to require of her. When she finally made her way down the narrow stair, she moved with deliberate slowness, taking in each step with an intensity that suggested she was approaching a threshold of profound consequence. The Duke stood in the library's central space, still dressed in his traveling coat, examining one of the volumes that Clara had recently bound. He did not turn toward her immediately upon hearing her approach, though his shoulders seemed to stiffen in acknowledgement of her presence. "I have been informed that you have undertaken the cataloguing of the entire East Wing collection," he said, his voice carrying the particular timbre that suggested he had been engaged in considerable restraint. "The Duchess is reportedly quite satisfied with your progress." "Welcome home, Your Grace," Clara replied, employing formality as a shield against the tremor that threatened to compromise her composure. He turned then, and the intensity of his gaze seemed to compress the space between them into something almost unbearably intimate. "I have missed you, Miss Merrow. The absence, which I undertook believing it would provide necessary temporal distance, instead served only to clarify the urgency of matters that I have been endeavoring to resolve. He set down the volume and moved toward her, with a directness that transcended the careful negotiations of propriety that had characterized their previous interactions. The legal matter regarding my mother's will has been resolved. The provision limiting my capacity to marry without forfeiting inheritance has been struck down on the grounds that such conditions constitute an unlawful restraint upon personal liberty. I am, as of this morning, entirely free to undertake such commitments as I deem appropriate, without consequence to my estate or position. Clara's heart seemed to suspend its rhythm entirely. Moreover, the Duke continued, withdrawing from his pocket a small box of considerable elegance, I have had certain time to reflect upon the manner in which I wish to proceed with the matter that has occupied my thoughts entirely since your departure from Harrowcombe House that rain-soaked evening months ago. He opened the box, revealing a ring of extraordinary beauty, the central stone a diamond of considerable size, surrounded by smaller gems arranged in a pattern that suggested both classical refinement and innovative artistry. "This ring belonged to my mother," he said softly. "She wore it not as a symbol of her union with my father, but as a symbol of her own independence, a reminder that she had chosen her own path despite considerable social pressure to conform to others' expectations. I wish for you to wear it, not as a symbol of possession or of obligation, but as a symbol of the choice that we have both made, independently and fully consciously, to construct a future together, despite the inevitable condemnation of those who regard such a union as fundamentally transgressive." He lowered himself onto one knee, a gesture of such formal devotion that Clara felt tears begin to accumulate in her eyes. "Clara Merrow," the Duke continued, his voice dropping to a register that seemed to encompass all the tenderness and intensity that months of careful restraint had been containing, "I am aware that I approach you not from a position of unambiguous virtue. I have fabricated documents, corrupted official records, exercised power in ways that propriety would condemn, all undertaken ostensibly on your behalf, but driven, I will confess, equally by my own desires and my own needs. Yet I find myself unable to do other than to ask, will you marry me? Not as an act of charity or obligation, but as a genuine partnership, a union in which we both undertake to support, honor, and cherish one another despite the world's inevitable judgment." Clara found herself reaching toward him, her hand trembling as it made contact with his cheek. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, with all the certainty that my heart possesses, yes." He rose and drew her close, his embrace conveying emotions that transcended the boundaries of language. Around them, the library seemed to contract into a space containing only the two of them, a sanctuary removed from the judgment of the external world. "There is one further matter," the Duke said, his voice muffled against her hair, "that requires address before we make our engagement public. The legal complications that I underwent to resolve extend beyond merely the provisions of my mother's will. I have undertaken to challenge, through every legal avenue available to me, the original conditions that established your origins as being entirely separate from the circumstances that would permit you to become the Duchess of Harrowcombe." Clara drew back slightly, her eyes searching his face for comprehension of what he was articulating. "I have established, through documented evidence that will withstand legal scrutiny, that the circumstances of your birth were not, in fact, those of a common servant," the Duke continued. "Your father was, in actuality, a gentleman of respectable standing, who became impoverished through circumstances beyond his control. Your mother died when you were an infant. You were placed in service not through poverty, but through necessity, through the failure of your father's family to acknowledge their obligation towards you after your mother's death. The papers establishing these facts, while they required a certain degree of creative documentation, are sufficiently authentic to satisfy legal requirements and social expectation." Clara's breath seemed to halt. "You have undertaken to reconstruct my origins entirely?" "I have undertaken to reveal origins that were always yours, but that circumstance and malice had conspired to conceal," the Duke replied with evident care. "You are not marrying into society as the woman who was once a servant. You are marrying as a woman of modest but genuine lineage, a woman whose position is not unprecedented, whose union with me does not constitute the transgression that society would otherwise regard it as being." "And what of the truth?" Clara asked, her voice barely audible. "What of the woman who actually did serve in that household? What of the humiliation that was entirely genuine?" "The truth," the Duke said gently, taking her hands in his own, "is far more complex than either version of your origins would suggest. The truth is that you are a woman of genuine intelligence, authentic courage, and real capacity for feeling, qualities that transcend the circumstances of your birth. The truth is also that society will never permit you to be recognized for those genuine qualities unless we provide it with a narrative that it can comfortably embrace. I have undertaken to construct such a narrative not as a denial of your experience, but as a bridge between the world as it truly is and the world as society requires it to be. He raised her hands to his lips. The choice remains yours, Clara. If you wish to repudiate these fabrications and insist upon the truth of your humble origins, I will support you in that choice entirely, but I believe you possess the wisdom to recognize that such insistence would serve no purpose other than to render our union unnecessarily vulnerable to condemnation. Will you accept my offer to become Duchess of Harrowcombe not as a redemptive narrative, but as the natural culmination of a union between two people who have chosen one another with clear eyes and open hearts? Clara looked at the ring in his open palm, the symbol both of his mother's independence and of the elaborate construction that he was undertaking to permit their future to exist. She understood with perfect clarity that she was being asked to accept a fundamental compromise, to embrace a carefully constructed fiction for the sake of a genuine emotion. I will wear the ring, she said finally, and I will marry you, not because I believe the fabricated narrative you have constructed, but because I believe in you, and because I understand that sometimes the world must be bent toward truth through the careful application of necessary deception. The Duke drew her close once more, and in the silence of the library, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries of literature, they stood together in a moment that transcended both the ordinary bonds of propriety and the careful fictions that society required to sustain itself. Outside, the February afternoon continued its slow progression toward evening, indifferent to the magnitude of the moment that had just transpired within the sheltered space of the library. And yet within those walls something had fundamentally shifted. The impossible had been rendered not merely possible, but inevitable. The announcement of the Duke's engagement to Miss Clara Merrow reverberated through London society with a force that seemed to rival the tremors of an earthquake. The carefully constructed narrative of Clara's origins, the orphaned daughter of a clergyman, educated in refined circumstances, discovered by the Duchess of Ashford, proved sufficiently credible to satisfy those inclined toward acceptance, while providing ample material for speculation among those predisposed toward skepticism. Yet the Duke had undertaken his preparations with such meticulous precision that the narrative, while containing elements of fabrication, rested upon a foundation of documented authenticity that rendered outright condemnation difficult to sustain. Letters purporting to establish Clara's legitimacy were produced, records were examined, the sheer weight of evidence, carefully assembled and strategically deployed, seemed to render opposition essentially futile. It was, however, during the third week following the public announcement that a complication of unexpected magnitude emerged, one that threatened to unravel the entire carefully constructed edifice of acceptance that the Duke and his allies had so laboriously assembled. A letter arrived at Harrowcombe House, bearing the seal of a solicitor representing the interests of certain relatives who had become cognizant of the Duke's modification of his mother's will. The letter was brief, coldly formal, and unmistakable in its implications. The signatories intended to contest the Duke's claim to his inheritance on the grounds that his actions regarding the alteration of his mother's legal provisions constituted a violation of the original testator's intentions, and therefore rendered him unfit to claim the estate. More significantly, the letter contained a barely concealed threat. Should the Duke proceed with his marriage to Miss Merrow without satisfying certain demands regarding financial compensation to the aggrieved parties, they would undertake to expose, through channels both legal and public, the falsified nature of Miss Merrow's origins and the elaborate deceptions that had been undertaken to render her acceptance into society possible. The Duke read the letter with an expression of remarkable composure, though his hands seemed to tighten visibly around the parchment. They believe themselves to possess leverage, he said quietly to Clara, who had been granted the privilege of reading the missive alongside him. They believe that fear of public exposure will compel me to capitulate to their demands. Will it? Clara asked, her voice steady despite the tremor of fear that seemed to course through her entire being. No, the Duke replied with a finality that suggested the matter had been resolved in his own mind long before the letter had arrived. I have anticipated precisely such a contingency. I have spent the past weeks constructing a counter-narrative sufficiently compelling that their threats, should they attempt to execute them, will rebound upon their own heads with considerable force. He rose and moved toward the window, his silhouette framed against the grey London afternoon beyond. The truth regarding Mrs. Rensley's embezzlement has been carefully documented and preserved. Her crimes, when disclosed, will render any narrative she might have constructed regarding your origins essentially irrelevant, as her credibility will have been utterly destroyed. Moreover, I have undertaken to establish, through channels that will withstand legal scrutiny, that the circumstances of your genuine birth, while humble, are far less scandalous than the fabrications I have created would suggest. He turned to face Clara directly. I have, in essence, constructed a series of nested narratives, each one capable of superseding the others depending upon the direction that events might take. Should these relatives attempt to expose the fabrications surrounding your origins, I will respond by disclosing the genuine circumstances of your birth, combined with evidence of Mrs. Rensley's crimes, rendering any accusation originating from that quarter essentially poisoned through its association with a woman of demonstrated dishonesty. "And your mother's will?" Clara asked, understanding that the legal question remained unresolved. "It will be upheld," the Duke replied with evident satisfaction. "The grounds upon which I challenge the restrictive provision have been accepted by the court on the principle that such provisions constitute an unlawful restraint upon personal liberty. The law has evolved sufficiently to recognize that a woman's capacity to determine her own future cannot be eternally constrained by her ancestors' fears regarding the purity of lineage." He extended his hand toward her. "We will not be intimidated into capitulation. We will proceed with our marriage, and should these relatives attempt to execute their threats, they will discover that they have chosen an opponent possessed of both the resources and the willingness to engage them in a conflict they cannot possibly win." The confrontation, when it came, transpired not in the private chambers of solicitors, but in the public arena of society itself. The relatives, perceiving that direct threats had proven ineffectual, attempted a different strategy. They began to circulate rumors regarding the authenticity of Clara's origins with sufficient persistence and specificity that the carefully constructed narrative began to show signs of strain. It was the Duchess who engineered the resolution with a directness that suggested she had anticipated this precise contingency. She summoned to Ashford Park a gathering of considerable social significance: intellectuals, patrons of the arts, women of influence, members of the judiciary. The gathering was ostensibly a celebration of Clara's engagement, but its true purpose was far more strategic. During the course of the evening, as the assembled company moved through the Duchess's drawing rooms, certain documents were discreetly made available: records establishing the genuine circumstances of Clara's birth, correspondence from respected ecclesiastical authorities confirming her parentage, and most significantly, irrefutable evidence of Mrs. Rensley's systematic embezzlement and the falsity of her accusations. The narrative shifted almost immediately. The relatives' accusations, understood now to derive from a woman of demonstrated dishonesty, were rendered essentially worthless. The genuine circumstances of Clara's birth, while humble, were far from scandalous. The daughter of an impoverished clergyman was not a transgressive figure in Victorian society, and the combination of the Duchess's clear support and the Duke's evident commitment to both legal rectitude and personal integrity seemed to transform the entire matter from a scandal into a romance. By the time the evening had concluded, the consensus of informed opinion had shifted decisively. Clara was no longer a woman of questionable origins attempting to penetrate society through deception. She was a woman of modest but genuine lineage, possessed of authentic intellectual accomplishment, who had earned through demonstrated merit the regard of one of England's most powerful and respected men. The relatives, recognizing that their strategy had failed entirely, withdrew their threats and eventually settled the matter of their financial claims through negotiation. The Duke emerged from the confrontation not weakened but strengthened, his reputation for integrity enhanced rather than compromised by his willingness to defend his choices through both legal and social channels. And Clara, observing this entire proceeding with a clarity born of her months of careful observation, recognized that she was marrying not a man of unambiguous virtue, but a man of genuine complexity, capable of deception when he deemed it necessary, but equally capable of profound commitment to truth when circumstances demanded it. "You have manipulated society with remarkable precision," she observed one evening, as they stood together in the library that had become the sanctuary of their courtship. "I have exercised power toward ends that I believed to be just," the Duke replied. "Whether that constitutes manipulation or merely the application of intelligence toward the rectification of injustice remains, I suppose, a matter of perspective." He drew her close, and in his embrace Clara felt the weight of everything that they had undertaken together, the fabrications and the revelations, the careful constructions and the hard-won truths, the elaborate architecture of their relationship built upon foundations both genuine and deliberately falsified. "When we marry," the Duke whispered against her hair, "we will do so not as victims of circumstance nor as beneficiaries of unearned privilege, but as two people who have chosen one another with clear eyes and open hearts, having fully comprehended both the cost and the value of that choice." The wedding itself transpired in late April, when spring had rendered the countryside a garden of extraordinary beauty. The ceremony took place at the small church nearest to Harrowcombe House, a modest setting chosen deliberately to emphasize that this union, while significant, emerged from authentic emotion rather than social necessity or aristocratic display. The guest list numbered perhaps 200, not the vast assembly that society would have considered appropriate for a duke's wedding, but rather a carefully curated gathering of those whose opinions carried genuine consequence and whose presence would substantiate the legitimacy of the union. The Duchess of Ashford occupied the place of honor nearest the altar, her presence alone a statement of unambiguous support that seemed to silence any lingering doubts regarding the propriety of the proceedings. Clara's gown was a creation of extraordinary simplicity, white silk of exceptional quality, adorned only with lace of her own careful craftsmanship, her hair crowned with a wreath of spring flowers rather than the elaborate jeweled arrangements that convention would have suggested. In her appearance, she embodied not the transformed woman elevated through external intervention, but rather the authentic individual whose genuine character had finally been permitted visibility. When the Duke first beheld her, standing in the church's entrance as the organ swelled with music of profound beauty, his expression revealed the vulnerability that he had carefully concealed throughout the months of their courtship. She perceived in his face not the satisfaction of having accomplished a desired objective, but rather the profound emotion of a man confronting the reality of a future he had barely dared to imagine. The ceremony proceeded with a formality that seemed almost anachronistic in its solemnity. The vicar, an elderly gentleman of considerable integrity, pronounced the words that bound them together with a weight that suggested he understood the profound nature of what was occurring, not merely the formal union of two individuals, but the transformation of society's understanding of what constituted a legitimate partnership. When the Duke placed the ring, his mother's ring transformed now through Clara's wearing of it into a symbol of revolutionary love, upon her finger the assembled company seemed to hold its collective breath, and when he lifted her veil and kissed her with a gentleness that somehow conveyed more intensity than passion could have accomplished, an almost audible sigh seemed to move through the gathered witnesses. The celebration that followed in the great hall of Harrowcombe House was characterized by an unusual atmosphere, a blend of joy and something else, something that resembled vindication. The Duke and Duchess moved through the assembled guests with an ease that suggested they had transcended the careful negotiations of propriety and entered into a kind of authentic inhabitation of their new relationship. It was toward evening, as the festivities were beginning to diminish, that Clara found herself standing alone in the garden that had witnessed so much of her transformation. The spring evening was warm, perfumed with the scent of blossoms, illuminated by the lingering light of the setting sun. The Duke found her there, standing beneath the stone arbor, where he had first discovered her weeping after Lady Honoria's cruelty. "I wished to find you here," he said softly, approaching with a tenderness that seemed to transcend the months of careful distance they had maintained, "to witness you standing in this place, not as the broken woman seeking shelter, but as the woman who has transformed that brokenness into something approaching wholeness." "I do not know if I am whole," Clara replied, turning to face him. "I remain acutely aware of the fabrications that have rendered this moment possible, the false documents, the manipulated narratives, the careful fictions upon which our legitimacy rests. Truth," the Duke said gently, "is far more complex than the simple dichotomy between authentic and false would suggest. Yes, certain aspects of your background have been embellished or modified, but your intelligence is genuine, your courage is authentic. Your capacity for feeling, your strength of character, your worth as a human being, these are not fabrications, Clara. These are the essential truths upon which our union rests." He took her hand, and the contact conveyed a tenderness that seemed to encapsulate everything they had undertaken together. "Tomorrow," he continued, "we will begin our life as the Duke and Duchess of Harrowcombe. Society will regard us with a mixture of approval and barely concealed curiosity. But what matters is not society's judgment, but our own understanding of what we have chosen to become together." Clara looked at the ring upon her finger, the symbol that had belonged to his mother, the woman who had defied convention for the sake of authentic emotion. She understood in that moment that she had not merely been rescued by the Duke, rather, they had rescued one another. He from a life of constrained emotional expression, she from a life of constrained visibility. "I am grateful," she said quietly, "not merely for what you have done on my behalf, but for recognizing that I possessed worth that transcended the circumstances of my birth or the humiliation I endured. You did not merely elevate me, Your Grace, you permitted me to elevate myself." The Duke drew her close, and they stood together in the gathering darkness, two people who had chosen one another with clear eyes and open hearts, having fully comprehended the cost and the value of that choice. Behind them, the great house blazed with the lingering lights of celebration. Before them stretched a future that remained uncertain in its particulars, but certain in its emotional foundation. And in that moment, standing in the garden that had witnessed both her deepest shame and her greatest joy, Clara understood that transformation was not a destination to be reached, but a continuous process of becoming, and that the greatest privilege she had been granted was not entry into society's upper echelons, but the opportunity to become fully, authentically herself. 18 months later, the Duchess stood in the library that had become synonymous with her personal triumph, examining the carefully organized catalogues that represented months of meticulous labor. The collection, once scattered and inadequately documented, had been transformed into a resource of genuine scholarly consequence, a library that drew researchers from across England and the continent, eager to access materials that Clara's careful curation had rendered accessible. But the library represented merely one aspect of the quiet revolution that had transpired at Harrowcombe House and across the surrounding estates in the months since the Duke's marriage to Clara. The market town nearest the estate, which had witnessed Clara's humiliation on that terrible evening at the ball, had been substantially transformed. What had been a space of commerce governed by rigid class hierarchies had evolved into something approaching a genuine community space. The Duke and Duchess had undertaken to establish a small academy for the daughters of tradespeople and minor gentry, an institution that would never have been conceived had Clara not possessed the lived experience of what it meant to be rendered invisible by society's casual cruelty. The academy occupied a handsome building that had once served as a minor administrative structure, but its significance transcended its physical architecture. It represented a quiet assertion that the daughters of the non-aristocratic classes possessed capacity for intellectual and personal development equal to that of their more privileged counterparts. Clara walked through the academy's classrooms with a satisfaction that transcended the merely personal. She observed young women engaged in the study of literature, history, mathematics, and natural philosophy. She witnessed teachers, women of genuine competence and intellectual rigor, transmitting knowledge to students who might otherwise have been condemned to the kind of invisibility that had nearly consumed her entirely. "You are creating a revolution," the Duchess observed, standing beside Clara as they looked out over one of the classrooms, where students were engaged in an animated discussion of Milton's Paradise Lost. A quiet one, perhaps, one that will not appear in the society pages or be celebrated in the drawing rooms of London, but a revolution nonetheless. "I am merely undertaking to ensure that no woman within my sphere of influence will be rendered as invisible as I was rendered," Clara replied, "that no young woman will be compelled to define herself by the moment of her humiliation, or to believe that the circumstances of her birth determine the scope of her possibilities." The Duchess smiled with evident satisfaction. "Your husband speaks of you with a reverence that borders on the worshipful. I suspect that the quiet revolution you are undertaking here may prove to be far more enduring than the careful management of his estates that occupies his primary attention." It was true that the Duke, in the months since their marriage, had undergone a subtle but profound transformation. The careful emotional restraint that had characterized his public presentation had not entirely vanished, but it had been tempered by a warmth that suggested the expression of genuine feeling no longer felt transgressive to him. He moved through his social roles with the same precision that had always characterized him, but the precision was now animated by a purposefulness that transcended mere fulfillment of obligation. That evening, as Clara and the Duke sat together in the library, their library now, the space that had witnessed both their courtship and the gradual construction of a shared vision, he produced a letter that had arrived in the afternoon post. "It is from my cousin," he explained, his expression suggesting some amusement. "He writes to inform me that he has witnessed the academy you have established and wishes to undertake something similar on his own estate. He inquires whether you might be willing to provide guidance regarding the organization and curriculum he might employ." Clara accepted the letter with evident surprise. The cousin in question was a man of considerable influence within the landed gentry, precisely the sort of individual who might have been expected to regard the Duke's marriage with skepticism and the academy with outright condemnation. "It appears," the Duke continued with a gentleness that suggested he had anticipated precisely such an outcome, "that quiet revolutions possess a capacity for propagation that more ostentatious forms of social change cannot match. One institution creates a template. That template becomes something others wish to imitate, and gradually the landscape of possibility shifts for those who had previously been condemned to invisibility." He reached toward Clara, taking her hand with a tenderness that had not diminished across the months of their union. "You have transformed not merely your own circumstances, but the circumstances of all those who come within your sphere of influence. The fabrications that rendered your entry into society possible have become increasingly irrelevant, as the authenticity of your character and the genuine value of your contributions have become impossible to deny." Clara looked around the library, at the carefully catalogued volumes that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge, at the space that had become sanctuary to both of them, at the evidence of the quiet transformation that they had undertaken together. "Do you regret," she asked, "the deceptions that you undertook on my behalf? The fabricated documents, the manipulated narratives, the careful fictions upon which our legitimacy was constructed?" The Duke was silent for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I regret the necessity for such deceptions," he replied finally. "I regret that we exist in a world sufficiently rigid and unjust that authentic worth requires the scaffolding of careful falsehoods in order to achieve recognition. But I do not regret the specific deceptions I undertook, because they permitted a genuine transformation that would not have been possible otherwise. Perhaps that constitutes a moral compromise, but I have come to believe that such compromises are not merely acceptable but necessary when they are undertaken in service of justice." He drew her close, and in the quietness of the library, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries, they sat together in a moment that seemed to encapsulate everything their journey had encompassed: the shame and the redemption, the fabrication and the authenticity, the impossible made possible through the combination of love and courage and willingness to defy the systems that would constrain them. Outside, the evening deepened into night. The lights of Harrowcombe House blazed against the darkness, visible for miles across the countryside, a beacon suggesting that transformation was possible, that dignity could be recovered, that love might indeed constitute a force capable of reshaping even the most rigid and unforgiving social hierarchies. And in the drawing rooms of London, in the country estates scattered across England, in the whispered conversations of society's arbiters, the story of the Duke and his Duchess continued to circulate, no longer as a scandal or a transgression, but as evidence of something far more profound, that the human capacity for transformation transcends the boundaries of class and circumstance, and that genuine love, when coupled with courage and commitment, possesses the power to reconstruct the very foundations upon which society rests. Dear beloved listeners, in the journey of Clara Merrow from the depths of public humiliation to the heights of recognition and love, we encounter a profound truth about the nature of human dignity and transformation. Her story reminds us that shame, especially the shame inflicted by others, does not define our essential worth. The cruel whispers in that ballroom, the deliberate humiliation orchestrated by those who mistook their social position for moral authority, sought to render Clara invisible. Yet invisibility, though painful, proved not to be a permanent condition. What strikes us most powerfully in Clara's arc is not merely her elevation in social status, but her internal recognition that her value existed independent of society's acknowledgement of it. The Duke did not grant her worth. He merely created the conditions through which her genuine merit could finally be perceived by those whose perception had previously been obscured by prejudice and hierarchy. But there exists in this narrative a deeper lesson that transcends romantic sentiment. Clara's journey teaches us that transformation often requires us to accept necessary compromises with truth, not lies that diminish our authentic self, but rather the strategic presentation of our genuine capabilities in forms that the world can comprehend and acknowledge. The fabricated documents that established her origins were deceptions, yes, but they were deceptions undertaken in service of a greater truth, that a woman's actual intelligence, courage, and capacity for feeling deserve recognition regardless of the circumstances of her birth. The Duke's willingness to defy social convention, to risk his reputation, his inheritance, his social position, in order to honor what he perceived as a profound injustice, reminds us that true nobility consists not in the mere accident of aristocratic birth, but in the courage to stand against systems of injustice, even when such standing is costly. His quiet revolution, undertaken not through dramatic proclamation but through careful construction of alternative possibilities, demonstrates that genuine social transformation often occurs not through violent upheaval, but through the patient, persistent creation of new institutions and new ways of being. Perhaps most significantly, Clara's story teaches us about the reciprocal nature of redemption. She did not merely receive salvation from the Duke, rather, they saved one another. She liberated him from the emotional constraint that had characterized his entire existence, while he created the conditions through which she might escape the invisibility that had been imposed upon her. True transformation is never unidirectional. It is always an exchange, a mutual becoming that benefits all who participate in it. In our own lives, we encounter both the humiliations that Clara experienced and the capacity, should we choose to exercise it, to defy those humiliations through the construction of alternative narratives about ourselves. We encounter also the opportunity that the Duke represents, the chance to use whatever power and privilege we possess, not to perpetuate systems of injustice, but to create the conditions through which others might achieve the recognition and dignity that are their birthright as human beings. The quiet revolution that Clara and the Duke undertook, the establishment of the academy, the transformation of the market town, the careful construction of institutions that rendered invisible women visible, reminds us that the most enduring social changes occur not through dramatic gestures, but through the patient, persistent creation of new possibilities, new spaces, new institutions, where those previously excluded might finally find recognition and voice. This is the true measure of their love, not the romantic declaration beneath the rain, though that moment retains its power, but rather the willingness to undertake a lifetime of quiet, persistent work to ensure that others would not experience the humiliation and invisibility that Clara endured. That perhaps is the greatest love story of all, love expressed not through words alone but through action, through commitment, through the sometimes uncomfortable work of transforming both ourselves and the world around us. We invite you, dear listeners, to journey with us into the world of Victorian romance, where love transcends the rigid boundaries of social hierarchy and where the quietest revolutions often prove to be the most transformative. If Clara's story of humiliation, courage, and ultimate redemption has touched your heart, we urge you to subscribe to our channel and join our growing community of those who believe in the power of authentic connection and genuine transformation. Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. What moment in Clara's journey resonated most deeply with you? Have you experienced your own quiet revolution, a moment when you chose to defy circumstance and create a new possibility for yourself? We would be honored to hear your reflections, your insights, and your own stories of transformation. Visit our channel regularly for new episodes of Victorian Romance, audio stories, where we continue to explore the intricate dance between love, society, and the profound human capacity to reshape our destinies despite the obstacles that would constrain us. Share this story with others who might benefit from Clara's journey, those who have experienced their own moments of public shame, those who believe in the redemptive power of love, and those who recognize that true nobility consists not in the accident of birth, but in the courage to defy injustice. We believe that stories possess transformative power, that the tales we tell one another across centuries and cultures remind us of our shared humanity and our capacity for profound change. Clara's story is in many ways all our stories. the story of what it means to reclaim dignity in a world that would render us invisible, and the story of what becomes possible when we choose to love, not despite our imperfections, but because of our commitment to honoring the imperfect journeys we all undertake. On behalf of the entire Victorian Romance Audio Stories team, we offer you our profound gratitude for joining us on this journey with Clara and the Duke. Your engagement, your loyalty, and your willingness to share in the transformative power of these narratives inspire us to continue creating stories that celebrate the quiet revolutions of the human heart. Thank you for being part of our community, and we look forward to many more chapters of love, redemption, and authentic connection in the stories yet to come. Yours in the spirit of Victorian romance and timeless love, the Victorian Romance Audio Stories team.